Picture this. You're standing in a room full of people you've known for years, co-workers, old friends, maybe even family, and something feels slightly off. Not dramatically wrong, not something you can point to or explain clearly, just subtly misaligned, like a song that's just a fraction out of tune. Conversations feel a bit rehearsed. Smiles arrive a second too late. Someone shifts the topic right as you begin to speak. Nothing obvious happens, yet something underneath the surface feels undeniably different. You go home later and replay it all in your head. You didn't say anything wrong. You didn't start conflict, didn't offend anyone, didn't cross a line. And yet the distance was real. The tension was real. That quiet, low-level discomfort hanging in the air was real. And here's the part no one really explains. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, and it wasn't your imagination. What you picked up on is one of the most consistent patterns in human psychology, a pattern studied deeply by Carl Jung. Once you understand what's actually happening beneath the surface, the confusion begins to fade, not because situations suddenly become easy, but because you stop blaming yourself for something that was never really about you in the first place. So let's break this down. Let's look at why awareness can make you threatening, why personal growth often turns you into a subtle target, and why becoming psychologically honest will almost always make certain people quietly uncomfortable. The structure behind human discomfort is not as simple as most people assume. We're taught to believe conflict has clear, visible causes. Someone lies, someone disrespects you, someone breaks trust, and the reaction follows logically. Cause and effect, action and response. But when Carl Jung studied human behavior more closely, he uncovered something far less obvious and far more unsettling. He found that a large portion of tension between people has very little to do with what was actually said or done. Instead, it has everything to do with what one person's presence stirs up inside another. To understand this, you have to understand one of Jung's central ideas, the shadow. Every person operates with two versions of themselves. There's the version they show the world, the composed, reasonable, socially acceptable identity. Jung called this the persona, essentially the mask we wear to function in society. It's not fake in the sense of being completely false. It's curated. It's built carefully over time. It reflects how people want to be seen, how they maintain control over their image, how they avoid rejection. Someone might present themselves as calm, generous, confident, or easygoing, and over time, that becomes the identity they protect. But then there's everything that didn't make it into that polished version. That's the shadow. The shadow holds the traits people reject or suppress in themselves. The anger they learned was unacceptable, the jealousy they feel ashamed of, the insecurity they try to hide. It contains the fear of not being enough, the desire for validation, the resentment they never expressed. It's not necessarily dark in a moral sense. It's simply everything pushed out of awareness to preserve the persona. Here's where it becomes important. The shadow doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. It doesn't fade over time or resolve itself quietly. It stays active beneath the surface, influencing behavior in subtle ways. And when something in the external world touches that hidden part, especially another person, the mind reacts. Not calmly, not rationally, but defensively. Sometimes even aggressively, and often in ways that don't seem to make sense on the surface. For example, imagine you have a friend who has always talked about getting disciplined, going to the gym, improving their life, becoming more focused, but never actually follows through. Over time, they build a persona around being chill or not too serious. That identity protects them from confronting their lack of action. Now imagine you quietly start improving your life. You wake up early, stay consistent, build habits. You don't lecture them, you don't compare, you just change. Suddenly, their behavior toward you shifts. They start making subtle comments like, "You're doing too much," or "Relax, life isn't that serious," or even joke about you trying too hard. On the surface, it sounds harmless, but underneath, something else is happening. Your discipline is brushing up against their shadow, the part of them that knows they've been avoiding effort. Instead of confronting that discomfort internally, their mind deflects it outward. It reframes you as the problem. You're not disciplined, you're obsessive. You're not focused, you're extreme. This is how the shadow protects itself. That's why awareness can make you feel threatening to others. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your behavior unintentionally exposes what others are trying to ignore within themselves. Your growth becomes a mirror. Your honesty becomes a spotlight. And for someone who isn't ready to face what's inside them, that can feel deeply uncomfortable. So they react, not to who you are, but to what you represent. This is where things start to make sense. Because when you become more aware, when you begin to see patterns clearly, notice inconsistencies, and operate with a higher level of psychological honesty, you unintentionally become a trigger for other people's shadows. Not because you say anything, not because you confront them, but because your presence alone introduces the possibility that you see what they're trying to hide. And that possibility is enough. Imagine someone who has spent years carefully managing their image. They project confidence even when they feel insecure. They perform kindness while quietly keeping score. They say the right things, smile at the right times, and maintain control over how they're perceived. Then someone enters the room who doesn't respond to the performance. Someone who isn't impressed by surface-level behavior, who doesn't react predictably, who seems to see through the act without making a scene. That alone creates tension. That person doesn't need to accuse or expose anything. Their presence is enough to feel like exposure. Jung described the next step as projection. Instead of asking, "Why does this person make me uncomfortable?" the mind flips the narrative. It assigns the discomfort outward. Suddenly, you're labeled arrogant, distant, judgmental, or too much. Not because of what you've done, but because it's easier to blame you than to confront what your presence reveals. And once projection takes hold, people stop responding to who you actually are. They start reacting to what they feel around you. That's why your behavior can remain consistent, kind, and reasonable, yet still be interpreted negatively. They're not interacting with you anymore. They're interacting with what you represent to them. This dynamic doesn't show up in obvious ways. It appears in small, almost invisible moments that build over time. There are specific patterns where this tends to happen. First, you begin reflecting what others have been avoiding. This is one of the most subtle but powerful shifts that happens when you start improving yourself. It doesn't feel like you're doing anything extraordinary. You're just making better choices. You wake up earlier, you become more disciplined. You start taking your health, your time, and your habits seriously. You're not announcing it. You're not trying to inspire anyone. You're simply changing. But that change doesn't happen in isolation. It creates contrast. And contrast is uncomfortable for people who have been avoiding the very things you're now confronting. For example, imagine a small group of friends who are used to meeting every evening to drink, complain about work, and joke about how life is hard. It's a routine, but it's also an escape. Then one person in the group decides to shift. He starts going to the gym in the evenings instead. At first, it's brushed off. "You've joined fitness people now," someone jokes. But as the weeks pass and he stays consistent, the tone changes slightly. "You're doing too much. Relax. You're not training for the Olympics. You've changed." None of these comments are openly hostile, but they carry a quiet resistance. What's happening isn't about him going to the gym. It's about what his actions represent. His discipline becomes a mirror reflecting their avoidance. His consistency exposes their inconsistency, and instead of confronting that uncomfortable reflection, it's easier to minimize him, to label him as extreme rather than admit they've been neglecting themselves. That's how reflection turns into tension. Second, you represent something they gave up on. This goes deeper than habits. It touches identity. Everyone has a version of themselves they once imagined becoming. The business they wanted to start, the skill they wanted to master, the life they wanted to build. But over time, many people quietly let those visions go. Not always because they couldn't achieve them, but because it required discomfort, risk, or discipline they weren't ready to sustain. Now imagine you step into that exact path. You start the business. You apply for the course. You leave the situation they stayed in. You don't make a big announcement. You just move differently. That alone can create tension. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your actions revive something they buried. It reminds them of a version of themselves they abandoned. For example, think of a woman who always talked about going back to school to finish her degree but never did. Life got busy, excuses piled up, and eventually she stopped mentioning it. Then her close friend, who was in a similar position, actually enrolls and begins attending classes. At first, she's supportive, but over time, subtle comments start appearing. "You have too much time on your hands. School is not everything. You think that degree will change your life? These statements aren't really about the degree. They're about the discomfort it creates. Her friend's action becomes a living reminder of what she chose not to pursue. Instead of confronting that feeling, it's easier to downplay the effort or question its value. That's how admiration quietly turns into resentment. Third, you stop needing their approval. This is where the shift becomes even more personal. Many relationships are built on unspoken exchanges of validation. One person seeks reassurance, the other provides it, and both unconsciously rely on that dynamic. It creates a sense of stability, even if it's not entirely healthy. When you begin to grow psychologically, one of the first things that changes is your need for external validation. You stop over-explaining your decisions. You stop asking for permission disguised as advice. You start trusting your own judgment. From your perspective, this feels like clarity, but from the other person's perspective, it can feel like distance. For example, imagine someone who always used to call a friend before making any major decision: what to wear, where to go, who to date. That friend becomes used to being the voice of reason, the one whose opinion matters most. Then suddenly, the calls stop. Decisions are made independently. Plans are shared after they're already set. The friend might not say it directly, but something feels off. They may interpret it as being shut out or replaced. You don't tell me things anymore. You've changed. But what they're really experiencing is the loss of a role they once held in your life. You didn't reject them. You just stopped depending on them in the same way. And for someone who derived value from that dynamic, that shift can feel uncomfortable. For example, picture a workplace where one colleague often uses sarcasm to undermine others. When they make a sharp comment, most people laugh awkwardly or try to defend themselves. That reaction reinforces the behavior. But then you respond differently. When the comment is made, you don't laugh, you don't react emotionally, you simply acknowledge it neutrally or move on. The energy shifts immediately. The person doesn't get the response they expected. And that lack of reaction creates discomfort. Not because you were rude, but because you didn't play your part in the script. It signals awareness. It suggests that you see the pattern. And for someone who relies on those patterns, that awareness can feel exposing. When you look at all of this together, a pattern becomes clear. You're not creating problems, you're revealing them. Your growth, your independence, your awareness, your refusal to play along with unconscious dynamics. These things disrupt what was previously comfortable. And when comfort is disrupted, people don't always respond with understanding. Sometimes they respond with subtle resistance, quiet distance, or unexplained tension. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you've changed in a way that forces others to confront what they've been avoiding. Fifth, you stop maintaining comfortable illusions. Every group, whether it's a circle of friends, a workplace, or even a family, runs on a set of unspoken agreements. These are the things nobody says out loud, but everyone quietly participates in. Maybe it's pretending that a certain person's behavior isn't as toxic as it actually is. Maybe it's laughing at jokes that aren't funny just to avoid tension. Maybe it's ignoring the obvious imbalance in how effort, respect, or responsibility is distributed. These agreements act like social glue. They keep things smooth on the surface, but only because everyone agrees not to look too closely underneath. The moment you stop participating in that system, even subtly, you disrupt it. And disruption, even when it's honest, is rarely welcomed. For example, imagine a workplace where a manager consistently talks down to employees, but everyone laughs it off to keep their job secure. It becomes normal. It becomes just how things are. Now imagine one person stops laughing. They don't argue, they don't create a scene, they just don't reinforce the behavior. Maybe they calmly redirect the conversation or respond without playing along. That alone shifts the energy. Suddenly, what was invisible becomes visible. The behavior feels more uncomfortable because someone is no longer helping to mask it. And the group, instead of addressing the issue directly, often reacts by subtly isolating that person. They might say, "You take things too seriously," or "You don't know how to flow with people." But what they're really reacting to is the loss of a shared illusion. Maintaining the illusion felt safe. Breaking it feels risky. So instead of changing the dynamic, the group tries to push out the disruption. That's the hidden cost of honesty. It exposes what others have agreed to ignore. Sixth, you start setting boundaries. This is where things become even more personal, because boundaries directly affect how people access you. Maybe for a long time, you were the reliable one, the person who always said yes, always showed up, always adjusted, always made things easier for everyone else. You answered calls at inconvenient times. You helped even when you were exhausted. You tolerated behavior that drained you because you didn't want conflict. People appreciated it, but more importantly, they got used to it. It became your role. And roles, once established, create expectations. Now imagine you begin to change that. You start paying attention to your own limits. You say no when something doesn't work for you. You take time for yourself without over-explaining. You stop accepting behavior that crosses your boundaries. From your perspective, this feels like balance, like finally respecting your own time and energy. But from the perspective of someone who benefited from your lack of boundaries, it feels like loss. For example, think of a friend who constantly asks for favors, rides, money, emotional support, but is rarely there when you need them. For years, you say yes without hesitation. Then one day, you don't. You say, "I can't this time." It's simple, respectful, and honest. But the reaction isn't what you expect. There's a pause, maybe a slight change in tone. Later, you hear comments like, "You've changed," or "You're becoming selfish." But what they're really reacting to isn't your refusal. It's the fact that the access they once had is no longer guaranteed. They weren't used to negotiating with you. They were used to relying on you, and now that dynamic has shifted. This doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes people genuinely don't realize how much they were taking until it's no longer available. But instead of acknowledging that, it's easier to frame you as the problem, because admitting, "I benefited from your lack of boundaries," is much harder than saying, "You're different now." Seventh, you move forward while others stay the same. This is often the most painful part because it involves people you genuinely care about. Growth doesn't just change your habits, it changes your perspective, your priorities, your tolerance for certain behaviors. And as those things shift, your alignment with others can shift too. Not because you're trying to leave anyone behind, but because you're no longer standing in the same place. Imagine two friends who started in the same situation, same mindset, same lifestyle, same struggles. Over time, one of them begins to change. They read more, think differently, take responsibility for their choices, start building something for themselves. The other remains where they are, not necessarily in a bad way, but unchanged. At first, nothing feels different, but slowly, conversations start to feel strained. Topics that once connected them no longer land the same way. One is focused on growth, the other on familiarity. There's no conflict, but there's distance. And that distance raises a silent, uncomfortable question. Why haven't I changed? That question is difficult because it requires honesty. It requires self-reflection. So instead of confronting it, the mind protects itself. It reframes the situation. You think you're better now. You've become too serious. You're not the same person. These statements aren't really about you. They're about the discomfort your growth creates. Your progress becomes a mirror reflecting their stagnation. And rather than face that reflection, it's easier to turn it into criticism. I once heard a story about two brothers who grew up in the same environment. One decided to break out. He moved, started a business, struggled, failed, and kept going until things began to work. The other stayed in the same routine, comfortable but unfulfilled. When they met years later, the tension between them wasn't loud, but it was there. The successful brother didn't brag. He didn't judge. But his life itself became a question the other couldn't ignore. And instead of asking, "What can I learn from this?" the reaction became defensive. You got lucky. Not everyone has your opportunities. It wasn't about facts. It was about protecting identity. When you step back and look at all these patterns together, a deeper truth becomes clear. The tension you experience isn't necessarily a response to something you did wrong. It's a response to the psychological pressure your presence creates. You're not triggering people by being harmful. You're triggering them by being honest, aware, and evolving in a way that challenges their internal narrative. This is what Carl Jung described through the idea of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating the parts of yourself you once ignored or suppressed. Individuation means becoming more real, more aligned, more independent in your thinking and behavior. But it's not a comfortable process. It requires confronting parts of yourself you'd rather avoid. And when someone else is actively doing that work, it creates a ripple effect. Because they become harder to predict, harder to control, harder to fit into predefined roles. They stop playing along with unconscious patterns. And that makes them feel threatening, not in a physical sense, but in a psychological one. So what do you do when you start recognizing this pattern? First, you accept that not every relationship will evolve with you. Some connections were built on who you used to be, not who you're becoming. Letting those relationships change or fade isn't failure, it's alignment. Second, you learn to separate genuine feedback from projected discomfort. Not every negative reaction means you've done something wrong. Some of it is valuable, but some of it is simply someone else reacting to what they feel around you. Third, you intentionally gravitate toward people who respond to your authenticity with respect, rather than resistance. These are the people who don't feel threatened by growth. They're inspired by it, or aligned with it. And fourth, you turn that same awareness inward, because you also have a shadow. You're also capable of projection, avoidance, and defensiveness. The goal isn't to become someone who sees through everyone else while remaining untouched. It's to stay grounded, self-aware, and honest about your own patterns. Over time, something begins to shift. Some people drift away. Some relationships dissolve quietly. That part can hurt, especially when those connections mattered to you. But something else happens at the same time. The relationships that remain become more genuine, more stable, and less dependent on performance. You feel less drained because you're no longer constantly adjusting yourself to meet expectations that don't align with who you are. You're no longer managing how you're perceived by people who wouldn't accept your authentic self anyway. And eventually, you come to understand something that changes everything. Not every form of rejection is actually rejection. Sometimes it's simply a reflection of what others aren't ready to confront within themselves. And once you see that clearly, you stop shrinking to make others comfortable. You stop apologizing for being a mirror. Because the truth is, you can't control what people see when they look at you, but you can decide whether you'll keep flinching every time they don't like the reflection.